Good evening, blog viewers. Today we'll continue again with John Cooper's excellent Pursuits of Wisdom book. We covered the Socratic way of life in an earlier post. We covered the Aristotelian way of life in the last post. And today we will discuss the Epicurean way of life as I'll, at the end of this post, to make certain remarks about how in some ways it is rather similar to, probably most similar to, the philosophy of life that many people now have today in the States and other liberal democratic nations, but in other ways is very, very different from that sort of dominant philosophy that may be followed by many in the States and other liberal democracies. And the Epicurean way of life, we see very immediately has extreme violent conflict and differences with the the Socratic and the Aristotelian way of life. Most principally, the Epicurean way of life had a very limited view of the power of human reason. For Epicurus, human reason could not at all figure out what the human good consisted of. It could not in any way rank human values. It could not in any way get clarity on ultimate realities of the universe, or ultimate realities or essences of human nature and human life. Reason, in short, for the Epicurean, had no independent insight into the truth with a capital T, the truth about human affairs, the truth about reality, truth about those sorts of things. And that was driven largely by a view that the Epicureans held, that the world that we see, the world that we go into every day, the world that we live in, is just simply a collection of atoms that sort of bounce against one another and collide and result in different sort of results on a daily basis. Atoms, natural. The world is the events of a day are a collection of the atoms that bounce against one another. They're a result of the operation of natural laws like gravity, the weather, and they're the result of human attractions and aversions that sort of operate on human beings on a day-to-day basis. Those three things together, not any sort of grand reality about reason or divine essences or divine realities or ultimate essences. Those things are all the world consisted of. Each day was sort of a random collection of the operation of these purely physical random forces, and that's all we have. That's reality, and that's it. So reason cannot go beyond any of this. Reason can only show us that's all there is, and that any thinker like Plato and Aristotle that sort of started with sense perception of the world and tried to build above that and sort of move beyond sense perception into the development of elaborate philosophical theories about human good, about the best human life. However well-intentioned those efforts may have been, and however well-intentioned the character of those philosophers may have been, ultimately these were foolish attempts to rise beyond basic reality. They were these men, Plato, Aristotle, and other lovers of human reason, perhaps Kant. These men were all in love with an illusion, and that illusion was that reason has powers to move beyond the sensory world and to give us some truth about human nature and human life and human good. So for the Epicurean, while reason could not do those things, reason was not totally powerless, though. What reason could tell us consistently, stably, reliably, even on a day-to-day basis, was that the only thing that was really good in the world, the only thing of pure value, unmitigated, unconditional value, was the experience of pleasure. Pleasure was the one thing that everyone enjoys across all nations, across all socioeconomic groups, across all occupations, across all ages. And of course, different people can have different kinds of pleasures, different things they enjoy, different things that are pleasing to them. But fundamentally, that is the only thing that we can really know on a stable basis, that people enjoy pleasure. and that when people are engaging in something they find pleasant, they instinctively feel it at the deepest level to be a good thing. Whenever someone doesn't feel this way about pleasure, the Epicurean believed, that was only because of some sort of poor, misinformed, misguided, prejudiced cultural education or upbringing they had that taught them to view pleasure as a bad when in fact it was really a good. Those things could be corrected from philosophy, from reason. This kind of person could be taught to actually enjoy the pleasure that they feel, but that's all that philosophy and reason could do. Nothing more than that. The Epicureans, contra Aristotle, and to some extent contra Plato and Socrates, thought that virtue, the practice of virtue and living a virtuous life, was not at all pleasurable. This was not something that everyone could. There was no particular pleasure in being virtuous, so they did not at all emphasize the practice of virtuous acts. So again, for the Epicurean, the only thing that is good in human life is pleasure, and that is the thing that we should focus all our efforts on, attaining and getting as much pleasure as we can first, and then doing all we can to maintain that pleasure over the course of a life. The Epicureans emphasize the importance of stable pleasures, stably maintaining pleasure in one's life, and focus on those kind of pleasures rather than pleasures that sort of came and went really quickly and caused pain in the end. We'll focus on that more in a little bit. For the Epicurean, if anything is pursued other than pleasure, Cooper brings this out in his description of the Epicurean life, say money, that thing would only have any value if it can further increase our pleasure, if it can further bring pleasures, stable pleasures into our life and allow us to continue enjoying pleasure. The money or whatever else it was other than pleasure that was being pursued was not independently valuable. The only value it had was in continuing to augment pleasure. And the Epicureans importantly stressed that everyone knows this, everyone knew this as a child. We all grew up instinctively liking pleasure and really thinking that, as a 6 or 7-year-old or 10-year-old, we all thought that, pleasures, that certain pleasures, that things we wanted and things we found enjoyable were really the only good things. We didn't think anything else in the world was really good. And so this is something we knew as a child. We were right in liking these things as a child, but over time, as we continued to get civilized and grew up, we continued to drift away from that correct understanding we had as children. We can correct this now again through philosophy by again showing us that pleasure is the only human good. So interestingly, though, and I think this is where we start to get divergences from, I think, the Epicurean way of life and sort of how we view pleasure in modern societies, many modern societies. For the Epicurean, there were two types of pleasures: the katastematic pleasure and the kinetic pleasure. And the katastematic pleasure was more valuable, more pure, and the one that was the best. The katastematic pleasure was just simply the pleasure we all have when we are fully conscious of our existence, when we are fully conscious of the natural goodness of life, of being aware of our self-consciousness, and when we attend to that and we're aware that we're existing and we are in sort of sitting somewhere and just enjoying the pleasure of existence, that is the truly pleasurable thing about life. I think some examples of when we most feel this way would be, for example, when we're engaged maybe in yoga, some sort of meditation activity, some sort of very, very slow walking where one is not distracted by anything, when we're sitting in maybe somewhere in a garden looking at our plants, certain moments in the shower when we're not doing anything, maybe if we're at a national park looking out at a beautiful vista, again, not distracted, or our thoughts are not pushed to other matters. We're just attending to the experience. And so these things were all katastematic pleasures, pure pleasures, and they were not at all mixed with pain, was the Epicurean insight. That these pleasures, the thing that was so good about these pleasures is they were pleasures unmixed with any pain, any stress whatsoever. They were just the utmost pleasure we could have in a moment. When someone is sitting there, for example, looking at the Grand Canyon, and they're not distracted, they're only filled with pleasure. It doesn't even make sense to say that there's any pain in the experience. It's only pleasure. The pain could only be brought in at that moment if something happened that they were distracted from that experience. For example, if a kid was to say, "Mommy, I'm hungry," or if a BlackBerry was to go off and someone was to get an email from from someone at work saying, "Have you done this?" That would destroy the catastematic pleasure, but it would only destroy it because we are now no longer in catastematic pleasure, but we're now focusing on this other thing. But as long as we're strictly in that state of consciousness, we experience only pleasure, and pleasure is unmixed with pain. Now, for the Epicurean, though, if all we did was just simply sit there looking at the Grand Canyon, sit there looking at our garden, sit there meditating or engage in yoga, life would get boring, and boredom was critically important. It was for the Epicurean, it destroyed pleasure. Being bored is a very bad thing, and it destroys one's pleasure of the natural goodness of life, the natural pleasure of existing, and therefore it was to be avoided. And so, since we could not live a full human life over 80 years, just sitting there looking at things aimlessly, we have to mix our pleasures a little bit. We have to enjoy these things called kinetic pleasures that have a certain sort of motion involved in it, either motion of the body or motion of the senses of some sort. And these things, for example, various hobbies we have, various eating certain foods or drinks, exercises of a certain sort, pursuing certain bodily pleasures, reading books, spending time with friends in conversations. These are all individually selected by each person. No two people have the exact same kinetic pleasures. But all of these things, they added sort of the spice to life that was needed, the variety to mix the catastematic pleasure that was so good, but stood always in danger of succumbing or degenerating into boredom as we continue to just focus strictly on the catastematic pleasure. And when we mix in these things, when we have a nice meal, when we have a nice drink, when we have a good conversation with a friend, when we read an interesting book, when we go to a ball game, these things provide the right mix of kinetic pleasure, and so that we can continue sort of get back to our catastematic pleasure and enjoy that. Now, these things, they could have, again, they're different for each person. There was not a specific regime of pleasures that were dictated as the best by the Epicurean. But these things, there had to be a good variety of them for the Epicurean, because if there was only one or two kinetic pleasures, then again, the risk would be boredom, as we continue to just do one or two things. So there had to be a good and interesting variety of pleasures, both of sense and of thought. And that did a lot to mix the catastematic pleasure so that we would not get bored. So the Epicurean was fundamentally a lover of many different activities, many different sorts of activities that had certain pleasures involved in it. He was, in some ways, we could think of him now as sort of a Renaissance man, pursuing many different loves of many different sorts. If the things he pursued had some sort of pain involved in it, that could be okay. For example, bike riding or some sort of mountain climbing involves some sort of pain. But the experience or the pleasure could not be fully mixed with pain or predominantly mixed with pain, because then it would be taking us too much away from pleasure. So therefore, it can have some pain, but not a lot of pain. And the activities that sort of were predominantly painful, the Epicurean would have no interest in. Now, in addition to not enjoying or not having an interest in the activities that create certain sort of pain, the Epicurean would also not have any interest in certain kinetic pleasures that are very intense. So certain intense pleasures where we really want a specific sort of pleasure, where we want it very intensely and we only want that one thing. That for the Epicurean was just foolish. There were so many things in the world, there's so many goods surrounding one, so many good pleasures that are to be enjoyed in the world. Why would someone pick one thing and want it so intensely? That was all ultimately self-defeating, because when one wants one thing and very intensely, then there's a lot of stress involved in it. There's a lot of disappointment when one doesn't get that thing. There's everything is sort of everything is riding on one getting that thing, and that is not promotive of that sort of catastematic pleasure that the Epicurean prizes of all things. So the Epicurean person will not in any way intensely pursue any sort of specific pleasure, but he will be open to, Cooper makes this point repeatedly, he will be open to various sorts of pleasures, and he will see that many pleasures are fungible. Certain restaurants may be preferred. We may love certain restaurants, for example, Ruth Chris. But if we can't afford Ruth Chris, or if Ruth Chris is closed that day, we can go to a Macaroni Grill or some other restaurant and still have a good kinetic pleasure, something that a good experience that will then further our life and allow us to continue enjoying the natural goodness of life and the catastematic pleasure. There's no huge catastrophe from the fact that we couldn't get that one pleasure, and Cooper applies that broadly to not only certain restaurants, but also various other pleasures we have in our life. We shouldn't intensely want any one particular one for the sake of variety, because we should understand reason tells us, even on an Epicurean view, that many pleasures are fungible. Well, at least the Epicurean thinks that. We have to question whether all pleasures are fungible. But in the end, the Epicurean wakes up every day happy because he knows he will be pursuing a suitable and interesting mix, as Cooper puts it, of pleasures in his day. Not only various sensory pleasures, but also those of thought and friendship. Cooper stresses repeatedly that friendship is very highly prized by the Epicurean, because when we have real friends and we pursue our friendships for in a genuine way where we want the best for the other person, then these friends add spice and add variety to the way in which we are even enjoying our kinetic pleasures. When we play with a friend basketball, or when we play tennis, when we read philosophy with a friend, it's very different than the same activities where we do it alone. It adds a level of complexity, Cooper says, and a level of engagement with the activity that goes far beyond what we would enjoy just alone. The experience ultimately becomes much more complex and much more interesting with a friend than alone. So in general, the Epicurean lives a very simple and private life, and not luxuriously with non-intense passions. The Epicurean has no desire for any fame, no desire for great money, no desire for any sort of great ambition or achievement, or there are explosive bodily pleasures and very varied bodily pleasures, because again, he sees many of these things as fungible. He sees many of these things as attendant with too much stress and toil that can destroy catastematic pleasure. The attainment of these things, I think we can all say, are all pleasurable once we finally attain them. But their achievement, we have to say, is usually bound up, and I think the Epicureans were right with this, with a significant amount of pain of one sort or another. Consider someone wanting to become a doctor and make a lot of money by being a doctor, or gain certain fame or reputation or esteem in the community. A person may ultimately get that, but in the process they have put themselves through a lot of toil, pain, stress, accumulating a lot of debt, studying for many difficult exams, being in a very stressful environment of medical school, and all of that would, over many years, that takes 10, 12 years to go through college and medical school and residency, and by the time one has gotten to that point, there has been a lot of destruction of this catastematic pleasure of the natural goodness of life that one would have had otherwise. And so the Epicurean would not be interested in these things. He would not be interested in any great fame, money, ambition, or achievement, because he would fundamentally consider these things as mixed with a lot of pain and stress that he would not consider as being worth the exchange. And we gave the example of the doctor. Another one would be fame in general. Fame is attendant. We see this with celebrities. Fame comes at a price, usually lack of privacy, many other ills that have caused many other problems for people that are famous. Even bodily pleasures, again, have that sort of, certain toil and sort of stress that's involved in constantly, pursuing various pleasures and seeking to get more and more pleasure in one's life of that sort. I think that's very clear that involves a lot of stress and some sort of discomfort in some way or another. As for money and those things, the Epicurean, again, would not need a lot of money to enjoy simple pleasures that provide kinetic variety, that provide the variety he needs. How much money, again, does one need to tend a garden, to go bike riding, to talk with friends, to meditate, to read a book? These are things that either involve very little money or no money, expenditure of hardly any money. Epicurean could satisfy his need for a variety of pleasures of the non-intense sort with very little money. And if a lot of money is desired, usually the Epicurean viewpoint would say that is usually for the result of intense or excessive pleasures, the desire or the pleasure for a very large home, for many sensual pleasures, for vacations that involve incredible luxury. And the Epicurean would see that, again, the greatest pleasure is that catastematic pleasure of self-consciousness. It has nothing to do with anything money can further, and so therefore they would, again, not be interested in that kind of thing. Gambling, and again, in terms of the moderation that the Epicurean would pursue, not be interested in something like gambling, because gambling, while it has certain pleasures, it would involve a lot of pain in the process, and that would not be something the Epicurean would be interested in. Cooper ends his section on the Epicurean life by focusing and highlighting very much the importance of friendship for the Epicurean, sort of a real friend where each person is sort of looking at the best, or seeking to find the best for each person and seeking to grow the friendship for its own sake, not for anything else that's desired on the basis of anything else, any sort of instrumental good from the friendship. This sort of person will pursue, the Epicurean will have a lot of friends because he understands, and deep friendships because he understands that friends do a lot to add to the variety of life. And to make the various pleasures that one is experiencing, in fact, more pleasurable. With a good amount of friends, Cooper says, one can be assured of having a rich and interesting variety of activities to engage in every day. And he says later that if one engages in the same activities strictly by oneself, then one typically gets bored. So now, as we've sort of sketched out the Epicurean philosophy of life, I want to conclude the post by sort of sharing some of my thoughts on this philosophy and how good it is for a practical life, for a whole life, and critically, not just for a day or two, but for a philosophy of a lifetime. Interestingly, I think this is actually the philosophy of life that most resembles sort of what we live in the States today, or in many other liberal democracies, where sort of faith in philosophic contemplation or human reason has been abandoned, where this sort of view of the world is chaotic and disordered and really just the result of various random events and physical laws over which reason can't really tell us much. That view has gained much acceptance. The study of philosophy has been more or less abandoned in many liberal democratic states, and many people are pursuing various pleasures now as that's sort of the aim and goal of life, as sort of the thing that they enjoy most, getting pleasure out of whatever they're doing, whatever is individually appealing to the person. And so much of our economy is in fact based on providing various sorts of pleasures to people of the preferred sort. So this is actually, in some ways, the philosophy of life that's most consistent with life in the States. But in another sense, as we sketched in this post, it's very different. It's very different from what we see in the States today, or in other liberal democratic states. Friendship has been weakened, has been really reduced in many liberal democratic states. Friendship, probably because of technology and certain advances of the internet, certain lifestyles where people live in very far from each other in communities that are very segregated, suburbs and the sort. friendship is not as strong, I would say, as it used to be, and not as central a virtue in people's lives. I think a statistic that's commonly quoted is that the average American male only has 2 friends by the age of 40. And sort of digital friendships have exploded, where people sort of loosely know one another through Facebook or through texting or things of that sort. But the actual human connection has been lost. And so the Epicurean would not at all, someone devoted to Epicurean would in fact not be, would be prizing his friendships much more than is currently today, would be furthering their friendships, would be seeking the good in their friends, seeking to really enjoy common activities with the friend strictly for the enjoyment that is involved in that, not for any other benefit. So that is, I think, one difference. And I think another difference is that the pleasures that people pursue today are very often either limited. There's not the variety of pleasures that I think the Epicurean would tell us to pursue. People, I think, in general pursue 2 or 3 or 4 different pleasures and sort of stop at that. So someone that enjoys going to bars a lot, or dance clubs, would not then go to museums, or would not read philosophy, would not be interested in politics, would not be interested in sort of certain forms of travel. So it's very the pleasures that are being pursued, I think, in some ways are become more limited in scope. And again, the Epicurean would not favor that, because the Epicurean would be a lover of various pleasures of various sorts. And then finally, I think people are pursuing pleasures with an intensity that was not praised by the Epicurean. Certain pleasures of money and bodily pleasures and many other pleasures are, I think, pursued singularly, as if the attainment of that one pleasure does really matter over and beyond, that there's no other pleasure that's fungible, that specific thing that one wants, that one thinks is pleasing, is the only thing that can provide pleasure in one's life, and one has to get it, because every other pleasure is sort of a zero in terms of what it can do for our life, and the pleasure that we want, that's the 100, and that's the only one worth pursuing. So I think that, again, would be something that the Epicurean would not, someone living an Epicurean life today would not do. So in this respect, I think I think Epicureanism is actually somewhat of a viable philosophy of life in the States, because it does not require much philosophical reflection or the use of reason. It doesn't really require much really intellectual study or a lot of schooling, but it's actually quite broadly accessible to various people, with certain small, maybe not so small, but with definitely certain variations in how the intensity with which one is pursuing pleasures, with the variety or lack of variety of pleasures, and with the strengthening of friendships to pursue the various pleasures rather than going it alone. I think there was a book called Bowling Alone, and that would sort of highlight the problem that bowling alone might have some pleasure, but the pleasure would be greatly amplified by bowling together. Beyond this, I think Epicurean as a way of life, for an entire lifetime, seems somewhat dangerous and is not acceptable for certain reasons. I think too many human faculties just don't get exercised and developed. If all that we are doing is creating sort of a pleasure bubble, of course, somewhat expanded and with friends involved in this pleasure bubble, I still think that is a limitation. That is a turning back from all human capacities and human perfection, and the desire to become, I think Nietzsche said it best again, the desire to become stronger as a human being, the desire to grow as a human being, the desire to extend one's reach as a human being. I think this philosophy would be absolutely contrary to that, would encourage us just to simply continue to build our pleasure dome around us, this little bubble that we can live a very comfortable, secure life, and to really, more or less, not really care about much else. I know Cooper sort of says that the Epicurean person would loosely have commitments to courage and justice and virtue and other virtues, in terms of seeing those things as sort of being a part of one's continuing meant of one's pleasurable sort of existence. But I think this is in general a lifestyle where someone can go many, many years living this kind of life and sort of grow smaller, as Nietzsche says, grow less developed, grow less human, have less contact with other people, have less connection with core human concerns and core human feelings as they're continuing to just engage in this pleasurable dome. and again, too many duties that are not pleasurable, that are not fun, too many things that are unpleasant and difficult and emotionally wrenching are sort of ignored because they're not pleasurable. And I think, again, that's damaging too as we continue to focus on creating and maintaining this pleasure dome. There's duties to the self to continue to grow, to develop, and that I think undeniably exists. There's duties to one's family and friends to help them in various points, all of which involve activities that are not at all pleasurable. And there are even duties to the human species as a whole to sort of, I think, make some contribution to human betterment. None of these things would be taken seriously by the Epicurean, and I think because of that, the Epicurean philosophy might be one that's suited for a day or a month or a couple years of one's life, maybe when one is coming out of a difficult period or stressful period and wants to sort of recalibrate back to a more pleasing environment. But I don't think at all that this is the philosophy of a lifetime or the motivational steer for the lifetime. If it is, I think to the extent that it's drawn out in Cooper's work in terms of varied pleasures, expanding of pleasures, different sorts of pleasures of not only sense but thought, pleasures with friends, I think that would be probably the better way to pursue it rather than the sort of Epicurean variations or simplifications that we have in our current society. And that's it for today. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.